Good morning and a very warm welcome back to the second day of the 6th Symbiosis Literary Festival, hosted by Symbiosis International Deemed University and Symbiosis School for Liberal Arts. It's fantastic to see so many bright, engaged faces ready for yet another day of intellectual discovery. If you were here yesterday, you would know that day one truly started with a bang, setting an incredibly high bar for discourse with none other than Dr. Shashi Tharoor. The energy continued throughout the day. We had the distinct honor of hearing from other key dignitaries, including Ambassador Verma, who shared profound insights from his compelling books, Echoes of Eternity. We covered a beautifully wide range of topics, traveling India through captivating travelogues presented by the wonderful Janvi Achrekar and Indrajit More. We also celebrated the rich cultural fabric of India, diving deep into its intricate art, crafts, and textiles with Iti Tyagi, Rashmi Ranade, and Dr. Gurvinder Gundev. We traced the fascinating threads of community history with Sudeep Chakravarti, Sangeeta Barua Pishroti, and Barry O'Brien. And just as it began with a bang, the day one ended on a very high note with a brilliant performance and conversation featuring the celebrated Sushma Deshpande ma'am. I know our heads are currently full of information, inspiration, and countless new ideas, but we have yet another day full of enriching and eventful events waiting for you. Today, we look forward to exploring a thrilling array of subjects, including Galaxies Within, Indian Voices in Science Fiction in memory of Professor JVNarlikar, the Literary Cartographies of India, Poured Narratives, India in a Glass, Anandibai Joshi, A Life in Poems, and a special tribute in celebrating Shyam Benegal. Finally, we'll conclude our festival with our esteemed chief guest, Javed Akhtar, at the closing ceremony. So without further ado, let's dive straight into the first captivating session of the day, entitled Galaxies Within, Indian Voices in Science Fiction in memory of Professor JVNarlikar. To take the session forward, I would like to invite Dr. Sami Ahmad Khan, Anil Menon, and our very own Dr. Sumithra Surendralal on stage. The session delves into science fiction with a focus on Indian science fiction and is a tribute to Professor Jayant Vishnu Narlikar, a renowned Indian astrophysicist, science communicator, and institution builder who made significant contributions to the field of cosmology and astrophysics. Dr. Jayant Vishnu Narlikar was an Indian astrophysicist born on 19 July 1938 in Kolhapur, Maharashtra, who dedicated his life to making science more accessible to the wider audience. In 1988, he founded the Inter-University Center for Astronomy and Astrophysics, IUCAA, in Pune, which he later developed into an esteemed institute for research and training in astronomy during his tenure as the first director. His efforts to promote scientific thought and curiosity included writing scientific treatises and science fiction stories, along with books and articles in different languages like English, Hindi, and Marathi. For all his contributions, he received the Padma Bhushan in 1965 and Padma Vibhushan in 2004. While his recent passing is a great loss, his work and legacy continue to shape and inspire future generations in their scientific endeavors. Joining us on this session are Dr. Sami Ahmad Khan, who is a writer, academic, and documentary producer. He is the recipient of the Mary Sklodowska Curie Actions Fellowship from the University of Oslo, Norway, a Fulbright FLTA grant from the University of Iowa, USA, and a UGC MANF Senior Research Fellowship from Jawaharlal Nehru University, India. He holds a PhD in Indian science fiction from JNU. His fiction has been the subject of formal academic research and a part of the university syllabi both in India and the US. His overview of the Indian science fiction has been translated into Czech, and his short stories has been translated into Marathi. His creative and critical writings have appeared in leading academic journals such as Science Fiction Studies, the Journal of Popular Culture Foundation, and university presses such as MIT Press, University of Wales Press, and Trade Imprints. His latest book is the critically acclaimed Star Warriors of Modern Raj, Materiality, Mythology, and Technology of Indian Science Fiction, which was longlisted by the BSFA Award in the non-fiction category. Dr. Khan currently discusses life, society, and science fiction at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, India. So you're most welcome here. We will also be in conversation with Anil Menon, who is an Indian computer scientist and writer of speculative fiction. He has authored research papers and edited books on evolutionary algorithms. His most recent work is the novel The Coincidence Plot. It was preceded by a collection of his speculative short fiction, The Inconceivable Idea of the Sun, Stories. His novel, Half of What I Say, was shortlisted for the 2016 Hindu Literary Award. Mr. Menon's debut novel, The Beast with 9 Billion Feet, was shortlisted for the 2009 Crossword Prize and the Carl Baxter Society Parallax Award. His stories have been translated into more than a dozen languages, including Arabic, Hebrew, Igbo, and Romanian. Anil is the chief editor of the Bombay Literary Magazine and a co-curator of the literature component for the Kala Ghoda Arts Festival. His short stories and reviews have appeared in the anthology series Exotic Gothic, Strange Horizons, Interzone, and others. Anil, you're most welcome here. Priya Sarukai Chhabria was also going to join us, but regrettably she's unwell and had to withdraw. However, in conversation with them is Dr. Sumithra Surendralal, who is a faculty member at Symbiosis School for Liberal Arts, teaching physics and mathematics. She received her PhD in physics from the Pennsylvania State University, where she applied theoretical and computational approaches from physics to studying bird songs and the neural systems behind them. Apart from her focus on modeling complex systems of various kinds, she is also drawn to questions about the nature of models themselves, particularly the way the fictive element of modeling, in which idealized worlds are constructed, plays a central role in how science produces knowledge. She is equally engaged with questions of science education, such as how scientific ideas are framed, modeled, and experienced in the classroom. In her teaching, she encourages students to experiment with these crossings between science and story, exploring what the literary imagination can mean for the sciences and what the sciences can mean for the literature. So, instead of Avengers assembling, we have nerds uniting on stage together.
Thanks, Isha, and thank you all for being here, for choosing science and writing over sleep on a Sunday morning. So welcome. So we have here with us a set of wonderful writers who, not just through their science fiction, but also through their writing about science fiction and speculative fiction, get us to kind of stretch our imaginations, think about what it means to be human, to share this planet, to share this universe, and also to be a part of this moment in time with all of the goings-on in the world, right? And they're great fun to read because they do this with a lot of irreverence, a lot of humor, and so hopefully we can see a lot of that in this session, so we're really looking forward to it. About science itself, you know, when we have conversations, a lot of people tend to say that they think of science as this fixed collection of facts, some sort of rigid edifice of truth. But science is a deeply human activity, and which requires a lot of imagination and intuition. Just like art, science grows through self-doubt and self-correction. Of course, that's the ideal world. And in many cases, science can sort of begin to get too caught up in its own momentum, in its technologies, and maybe in institutional priorities. And that's also why science fiction becomes so important, because you know, we get to think about both how to look at the world with immense wonder and curiosity, but also try and get a sense of what happens when things go astray, and everything else in between. So Isha talked about how this session is a tribute to Professor JVNarlikar. He was popularly known as JVN. And I think JVN embodied the ideal spirit of science quite closely. Among many things that he did, he worked with a group of scientists to look at alternative frameworks to the Big Bang model. Right? So they, along with his advisor Fred Hoyle at Cambridge, he worked on this, what are called the steady state theories and the quasi-steady state theories. These looked at what happens if you think of the universe as being continuously in existence, rather than appearing with like the single explosive bang. Right? And it's not that JVN rejected evidence that was quickly building up about the Big Bang model. It is that JVN thought it was important to still continue to ask questions such as, what does it mean to have a beginning? And in the sciences to also kind of ask if the right questions have yet been asked. So this was, I think, wonderful about him. He was also an institution builder. So Isha talked about how he was a founder director of Ayuka here in Pune. He was also a great science communicator and a wonderful writer of science fiction. So maybe we could start with that. So Anil and Sami, if you can talk a little bit about JVN's science fiction and your own interaction with it, maybe that would be a great way to go. Yeah.
Thank you, Sumithra, and thank you, SLF, for having me here, and even more importantly, having a session dedicated to JVN. JVN was an absolute legend. I mean, just imagine getting the Padma Bhushan when you were, 26? Getting a PhD when you were, 23? Right? And not only has JVN, so not only was he at the forefront of, say, science policy, science communication, science popularization, scientific research, the way India, a newly independent India, interacted with the idea of science and its policy, but also he was into science fiction. And so basically, he was doing everything that was possible. And he was doing it not just for his peers in the scientific community, but also for, say, school children. He was writing science fiction for school children. He was writing policy documents for the government. He was writing research papers for his peers. So whatever verticals you can consider when it comes to sort of science and science fiction, communication, popularization, he was doing it. Right? And I'm so happy that this session is being held in his memory, because it's a matter of great pride for every individual in this country who belongs to the scientific and the science fictional communities to have this kind of a contribution spread over a lifetime acknowledged. So I'm going to talk about his science fiction, and maybe Anil Bhai can talk about his science. He's the science guy. So in terms of, say, novels itself, so he had like 5 or 6 novels. The first novel was called Preshit, which was then translated as Message from Aristarchus. Then second novel, Return of Vaman Paratna Ala, The Cosmic Explosion, Virus, Sanctuary. So just 5, 6 novels in a span of 30 years. He also had multiple short story collections. The most important of them are Dhoomketu, The Comet. It came out in 1986, and Yakshopahar, The Gift of the Yakshas, came out in 1999, which had like 20 or around 30 short stories. So let me just talk about just zoom out and talk about the kind of science fiction that he was doing. So if we analyze and if we read his science fiction, which has been widely translated, so he used to write in Marathi, and then he translated it himself into English or Hindi usually, and then other people translated it in other languages. So the versions that we have available. So unfortunately, I do not read Marathi, so I had to rely on the Hindi and English translations, which were executed by JVN himself. So there's a certain kind of authorial credibility, because it's the author who's translating his works himself. So there are 4 major strains, or 4 major kind of typological classifications that can be executed with JVN's work. The first is the idea of global science fiction, right? So the first kind of stories he writes engage with the common themes and the common tropes of global science fiction, right? For example, AI. Now, when we talk about AI, we talk about, say, Star Trek, we talk about Star Wars. AI is such a fundamental theme of today's world, has been for quite some time now, at least in the science fictional imagination, and now especially in the social imagination, right? So the first kind of stories that he writes engage with the idea of common themes and tropes and topoi prevalent in global science fiction. For example, the rogue AI in his novel Return of Vaman. That's the first kind of science fiction he writes. The second kind of science fiction he writes is primarily meant to communicate and popularize science. Now, these are narratives, these are stories he's writing for school children, primarily, And through this, he wants to introduce scientific ideas to general audiences. Example, Gayab Tara, the missing star, which is about a Dyson sphere. This is a story he writes. So again, Dyson sphere, massive concept, and he takes it to the sort of school audiences, and he does that. The third is he writes about science and the context in which science operates, specifically in India, right? So he has a story called Putravati Bhav, may you be blessed with like 1,000 sons, in which he talks about what is going to happen if you can develop a certain sort of okay, spoiler, I shouldn't talk about it, but basically it talks about gender imbalance in India and how science is, how science is entangled with the idea of social, historical, and material realities, right? And the fourth kind of science fiction that he writes is usually a template that covers all three, 1, 2, 3. For example, in this story called Ahankar, which is about a love triangle set in space, it's doing part 1, it's doing type 1, type 2, type 3 at the same time, right? And I would like to sort of end with how I first met JVN. I was a kid in the 90s watching Doordarshan, and there was this lovely series called Brahmand, which was telecast on Doordarshan, and it was kind of a remake of Carl Sagan's Cosmos, for which JVN provided Hindi commentary for Doordarshan, right? And then JVN met, I think, Rajiv Gandhi and said, I want to do something similar for India. And Rajiv Gandhi said, yes, sure, go ahead. And then that is how, Brahmand, India's answer to Carl Sagan's Cosmos, was born. And we also read JVN in school, right? And JVN was a part of the NCERT, CBSE syllabus, the adventure, the comet, right? So it has been an absolutely fascinating journey to know a man who could have done so much in his life.
He gets to talk about stories, and I have to talk about general relativity. So that's not going to happen. Okay? So, yeah. So, actually, the first time I read Dr. Narlikar's story was in the Illustrated Weekly of India. Kushan Singh used to publish all kinds of authors. And he had published a couple of stories of Dr. Narlikar. And I didn't know at that time. I wasn't paying attention to the authors' names, but the story stuck with me. It was called The Adventure. And it was about a parallel history story. What if the third battle of Panipat had actually been won, right? If the Marathas did not lose to the Durrani Empire, right? How would India's history have changed? It was an exploration of that idea. And in Dr. Narlikar's view, what would happen is the East India Company would not take over. The Marathas would, India would eventually become a democracy. We would not have the colonial legacy. And all of it was lost on me. Because for me, it was just a parallel history story in which the third battle of Panipat had not been lost, right? Many years later, when I began reading science fiction, the thing is, where do you read someone like Dr. Narlikar, right? We don't have anthologies, we don't have collections of Indian science fiction. So there was not much of an opportunity to actually read Indian authors who work in science fiction. So most of my reading was done on the usual, the classics, the golden age, then the authors down in the 80s and 90s. So I got to Dr. Narlikar actually much later when I came back to India, and I began looking for writers who were working in science fiction. Then I began reading Dr. Narlikar's stories. And then you notice that there are, like as Sami pointed out, clear patterns in the kind of topics that he likes to talk about. And for him, science was really important, right? It wasn't just something that you could relax, for example. You could break Newton's law in a story. He would never do that, right? So I remember, when we did a workshop at IIT Kanpur, it was a residential workshop, And I'd called Dr. Narlikar to come talk to the students. And he came for a day, and he spent a session talking about science fiction. Now, I told the participants that science, I can take it relax, right? It's not, you don't write a story to teach them grammar, right? And you don't write a science fiction story to teach people science, right? And the participants had kind of absorbed the lesson that you can break rules, the energy of the conservation laws can be broken. You can generally play fast and loose with the science aspect of the story. So the first thing they asked Dr. Narlikar was, how closely do you have to stick to the science? And he said, of course it has to be scientifically correct, right? Otherwise it is not a science fiction story. So he had a very clear-cut idea of what constitutes a science fiction story. And I think it's perhaps the old-fashioned view in which science fiction is seen as a didactic instrument, right? You give kids science fiction stories and say, "Acha beta, tum engineer bano," right? That is the general purpose of science fiction, to teach science. And I think he saw that as almost like a patriotic act in which you want to inculcate, the old books used to say the scientific temperament, right? And I think that was the goal of his writing. But on the other hand, he was also an institution builder. The interesting thing is, in terms of the literary sphere, I don't think he did the institution building that he did in the scientific sphere. So the Ayuka, for example, was explicitly intended to encourage science activity, right? But not in the literary sphere, which I always found interesting. And perhaps Sami can talk about it at some point as to why that was the case. So things like workshops, or things like doing, talking to young writers, things like that, generally speaking, that was not part of his scheme, right? Yeah. But he was a force. He was someone who changed the field. And in a sense, when you write science fiction today in India, you are kind of acknowledging his legacy. Yeah.
No, yeah, Sami.
Just to add to that, so JVN once said that Star Trek is bad science fiction. Like, this is horrible. And when asked why, he said, because this is faster than light travel. If you have FTL, this cannot be good science, therefore it cannot be good science fiction. And he trashed it completely. He's like, so he came from that kind of a perspective that, you need good, solid science to tell your story. And this is important because a lot of science fiction being written today, especially that is being written by scientists, say Sukanya Datta, JVN, so this kind of follows the same model, but you also have other kinds of science fiction writers who approach the idea of science from a different vantage point, right? From the political, aesthetic, etc. So just to put it out there, that there are different ways to look at the idea of science itself, right? Therefore, automatically, there are different ways to write science fiction. There's no one way to write science fiction. Though, of course, if you're trying to communicate science and popularize science, you stick to the basics of science. But 80% of science fiction writers today do not really adhere to this, and they just are writing from different vantage points for different purposes, and ultimately just having fun.
Yeah, I think, maybe we could talk about that next. As you heard, Professor Narlikar was very strict about his science fiction. He wanted to get the science right, and the fiction was perhaps a vehicle for the sciences. But science fiction has many other forms, and it has also evolved. So maybe we could, if both of you could talk to us a little bit about, in your view, what is science fiction? And what is this other term we hear, which is speculative fiction? Anil, for example, in this collection of yours, and thankfully collections of stories now exist, Indian science fiction stories, right? You refer to science fiction as the crazy uncle in the speculative fiction family, right? So if you can both just talk about how do you think about science fiction and speculative fiction, that would be great, yeah.
Yeah, so, science fiction is, Bruce Sterling had a beautiful description of science fiction. He said that the golden age of science fiction is 14, and typically it's young adult fiction, right? That's how it started out. And I think to a large extent has never lost that historical origin, right? It is primarily fiction that really appeals to younger readers. And of course, it's not by no means restricted to them, but by and large, that influence has always been there. And there are two kinds of science fiction writers, I think. There's the one kind for whom, when you say science fiction writer, that is their identity, right? They write science fiction stories, and that's all they write. And there's the other kind of writer who writes science fiction stories, right? And they do other things as well. So, for example, E.M. Forster, right? You won't think of him as a science fiction writer, but actually he wrote one of the best stories in the science fiction genre, The Machine Stops, right? And it's a story for which Dr. Narlikar was a consultant. They were staying, I think, in Cambridge in the guest quarters, and E.M. Forster had come to Dr. Narlikar and said, I have a story, and it involves some technology. Would you take a look at it? And Dr. Narlikar talked about how he had read The Machine Stops and gave a few suggestions, which E.M. Forster incorporated into the story, right? But for Forster, for someone like Forster, it is something you do along with your other writing, right? You write stories about relationships, you write stories about history, you write stories about science, and I've always seen myself in the latter category. So for me, that the idea that you only write science fiction is not so interesting as much as is one of the things you do, right? So Amitabh Ghosh, for example, wrote Calcutta Chromosome. That is, in fact, a science fiction story about a virus that confers immortality through the malaria, through the mosquito, right? But that's not the only thing, of course, that Amitabh Ghosh does. And I think, especially in India, that career is possible, where you write science fiction, but you can also do a great many other kinds of fiction, right? It is much less, it's much more harder, it's much harder say, in the US or UK to make that transition. So if you, for example, you write science fiction stories, you tend to be cataloged as a science fiction writer. Whereas here, it's a lot more flexible, right? So you find writers moving between science fiction and other genres. In terms of what is a science fiction story, I think it's very simple. I think it's a story in which some scientific idea is essential, right, for the story to work. Otherwise, the story would not work. So the science is essential in some fundamental way. For me, that would constitute a science fiction story. For example, in E.M. Forster's story, the science is essential in the sense that he imagines a world in which everything is run through this machine. And people have forgotten what it is to be independent, to communicate with each other directly, to talk, to walk out. It's actually the plot of Silo, right? The Apple show Silo. And one day the machine stops, and the humans have to deal with a world in which there is no more machine to take care of them, right? So in that kind of story, the science is essential. You cannot take away the idea and then still have the story, right? So for me, that's an example of a science fiction story. In terms of speculative fiction, I would say that, let me put it this way. Every story has 3 kinds of sentences, right? So the first sentence is the sentence that the writer writes. The sentence that I write is the first kind of sentence. The second kind of sentence is the one that I don't need to write because you already know it. It's something that we share in common with the world. So if I say it's raining, I don't need to say it's raining water. Of course it's raining water. What else would it be raining, right? We understand that I don't have to write the word water because we both agree that that's how raining works, right? So the second kind of sentence consists of context, the kind of sentences that we both can take for granted. The third sentence is a sentence that the reader writes. They complete the story, right? So actually, I write 1/3 of the story. The second third doesn't need to be written. And the final third is something the reader does to close the story, to make it complete, right? So I have only control over 1/3 of it. In speculative fiction, it is a second sentence that you play with. So for example, you think you know how law works, or you think you know how human psychology works, you think you know how governments work, or you think you know how security works, and the context is taken for granted. But in a speculative fiction story, when you read the sentence, it was raining, and then the next sentence might be, it was raining diamonds. And suddenly you realize that you are not on planet Earth anymore. You are on a planet in which it can rain diamonds. So for example, on Jupiter, because of the enormous pressure in the atmosphere, you find that carbon is compressed into diamonds. And when it rains on Jupiter, it rains diamonds, right? Suddenly the context of the story has changed and you realize, oh my God, I'm not on Earth. I'm on some other planet. And you suddenly don't know what the rules are of the story. And as you read, you and the writer kind of figure out what the world is like, right? So it is in the second sentence, I think, speculative fiction comes into its own. When the context is science or context is technology, you get a science fiction story. But you can play with other contexts. For example, language. You can play with language. In almost every language, we have subject, verb, object. And you can perhaps play with that, right? You can come up with a different kind of language in which meanings are different, right? So I think speculative fiction is fiction in which you play with the context of the world. And so you don't know as a reader how exactly it's going to change. For example, in Gautam Bhatia's recent novels, his context is law. It's a world in which it's a very different legal setting for the world. And as you read the story, because your understanding of the law and his explanation of the law, use of the law, is so very different, the story becomes fascinating because you can't figure out the context until you are some way into the story, right? So for me, speculative fiction is fiction in which you play with the context of the world, which before you read the story, you could take for granted, but not anymore, right? So I will turn over to...
I think my response has three different dimensions. The first is a thought experiment. The second pertains to definitions. And the third is about history of Indian science fiction. So let's begin with a very quick thought experiment. And please bear with me. You see this bottle, right? Do you see this bottle right in front of you, right? So it's kept here at a particular location in the space-time continuum. Now just close your eyes for like a microsecond. Please bear with me. Please just close your eyes. Yeah, of course. Please just close your eyes.
Can we have some lights in the audience, please?
Right, so eyes closed now. Eyes open, please. Right? What has happened? What has happened? The bottle has shifted, right? From point A in the space-time continuum to point B. Now, if you were writing about it, forget that you're a researcher. Suppose you're a writer, you are writing about this particular phenomena that you just witnessed. How would you write about it? What would you say happened? So very, very quickly, what's the first reaction, the first thought that comes to your mind when you see an object changing sort of places within the blink of an eye? Like, assume that no time passed, between these two different phases. How would you define it? How would you write about it?
Would you like some responses?
Yes, absolutely.
Can we have the mics go around, please? Anyone who wants to take a shot? So I see Vatsla's hand up there.
Hello. Yeah, how I would describe it is probably teleportation. Like there's a sudden jolt and then you open your eyes and like the bottle has mysteriously transferred.
Awesome, great. But teleportation using what? How exactly? So yes, the thing moved, right? But how would you define it? What is the kind of terminology, the lexicon that you would adopt to describe something like it? Teleportation, absolutely. What else? We can have maybe one more response before we move on. One quick response. Just off the cuff. We are just trying to sort of, world build here. As simple as that.
Plenty of imaginative minds here. One more response.
One word response, please.
How would you describe it? I think there's one hand up here. Okay. Neha here in front. Oh, okay, there are two. Can we take two?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so then two.
All right. I would describe it as to be magical.
Lovely, right? So now we have magic. So from teleportation, we move to the idea of magic. What else? I think we had one more.
Okay, I think space expanded, time froze.
Lovely, right? So as you said, it's the same kind of phenomena being witnessed by all of us, the same kind of external stimuli, yet the way we rationalize it, the way we talk about it is different, right? Somebody says, this is happening because of magic. So think double door apparating. Think Harry Potter, magic, right? The science fiction guy would say, well, this is because your constituent atoms are being disassembled and reassembled at a different location. This is teleportation. Think Star Trek. Somebody else might say, no, this is actually the result of the will of a divine being. Say Thor, the Bifrost Bridge in mythology. So despite the same initial phenomena, the way we write, the words that we use, magic, if it's magic, it's fantasy. If it's the will of a divine being, it's mythology. If it's teleportation, it's science fiction, right? So what is the kind of lexicon that we adopt to describe external reality? That kind of tells us about what kind of world building we are engaging in, right? So now when you start writing, think about what is that vantage point from which you want to write and create new worlds, and what are the kind of genre conventions you want to engage with, the themes you want to talk about, right? So coming back to science fiction, right? So speculative fiction is, say, science fiction plus fantasy, plus mythology, plus horror, like things which are speculative, you know? And science fiction is just one branch, or one aspect, one type that kind of uses a certain scientific explanation, but not just a scientific one. It can also be a pseudo-scientific explanation, a proto-scientific one, you know, a quasi-scientific one, because the idea of science also keeps on changing, right? Phrenology, for example, alchemy, for example, science at a particular space-time, you know, like epoch, not science anymore, right? So when you write science fiction, do not just think science. Also think quasi-science, alternate science, proto-science, pseudo-science, the different kinds of science, indigenous scientific literacies, that also constitutes the idea of science fiction. So when you world build, keep these things in mind, please, if you want to write science fiction stories, that is. You know, the second, very quickly, was about the idea of definitions, right? So Anil Bhai gave us some really interesting definitions, and I'll just sort of go back to some classic ones. Somebody, so Hugo Gernsback, 1920s. He's like, science fiction is 75% literature, 25% science. Counter question: what if it is 74.9% literature and 25.1% science? Is that still science fiction? Doesn't work. Then Asimov, the great Asimov himself. Science fiction is the literature that deals with the reactions of human beings to changes in science and tech. Yeah, this somehow works, but then we problematize. Christopher Evans says it's the literature of what if, but then what if can also be magical. Norman Spinrad says anything published as science fiction is science fiction. He's like, I'm not going to enter into this debate on which like 1 million books have been written, and nobody agrees. No two scholars of science fiction agree on the definition of science fiction, right? So while you engage with it, you have fun with it, remember that no two definitions are the same, and no two people agree on it, right? And next, do not see science fiction as a genre at all. Science fiction is not a genre. Science fiction for me is a mode of storytelling, because you know what? If science fiction were a genre, now what is a genre? Romance, mythology, horror, right? Thrill, suspense, different genres. If science fiction were a genre, how do you explain Koi Mil Gaya? It has science fiction, it has romance, it has mythology, it has horror, it has suspense, it has all of these genres. And that is the way Bollywood and a lot of speculative cultural production works, in that it's not really one genre, but a place where different genres meet. And that kind of depends on the kind of knowledge systems available and the vantage points of people who are writing. Third and final point, very quickly. Indian science fiction. Right? So when we talk about Indian science fiction, the first thing we get is, hey, do you guys have science fiction? Do you guys have science fiction? That's the first response. The second is, what is science fiction? Right? So let me very quickly take you through the history of Indian science fiction across just 3 languages. Quoting from just 3 languages. 1, Bangla. J. Ray's Shukra Brahman, 1879. Hemlal Datta's Rahasya, 1886. J.C. Bose's Paltak Tufan, 1896. So this is the same time when science fiction is almost coming to, of age in the global north, right? In Hindi, Pandit Ambika Dutt Vyas Ashcharya Vritant, 1884. Babu Keshav Prasad's Chandralok Ki Yatra, 1900. Just don't read it with Hans Pfaall, because it's like a translation of Hans Pfaall. And then Indian English. One of the first texts we have is K.C. Dutt's A Journal of 48 Hours, published in 1835. 1835. Another text we have is S.C. Dutt's The Republic of Orissa, published in 1845, and of course, Rokia Sakhawat Hussein's Sultana's Dream, 1905. So it is clear that science fiction is not something which is a recent import to this country. This has been available in Indian languages, in the public articulation for quite some time. It's just that we say that, no, this is a genre that came to us in the 21st century. Either that is, or our response. Or our response is no, but we have had it for like 10,000 years. And data doesn't support both of these claims. Even a cursory study, says that we have had a tradition of science fiction across different languages. They might not be translated, but that literature which is not translated doesn't mean that it's not read. So it's in a language that we don't read. As simple as that. Yeah, that's it from my side.
Yeah, and maybe we can just continue in that vein because we are talking about Indian science fiction and what is this Indianness that's there about Indian science fiction? If you could both address that. And I know that Sami also has a model about Indian science fiction and how to think about framing stories in Indian science fiction. So we could either have Anil go first, and yeah.
Sure. So I'll try to delay Sami from presenting his model as long as I can, because that was his doctoral thesis. And trust me, you don't want to go too much into it, right? Yeah. So about the Indian thing, I think it's for me, it's like asking what is an Indian romance, right? It doesn't really make much sense. India is somehow important to the story. It can be set in India, then it would be... So there are two ways to look at it. One is that the story is set on the subcontinent. That would make it a science fiction story from India. Or it could be by somebody who is of Indian origin, right? That's the other way of looking at it. And for me, both are fine. I have read stories in which India plays a central role in the story, and some of them are really old. So for example, there is this Malayalam science fiction story that was written in, I think, 1891 by Vayanar, and it is called Dwaraka. And it is remarkable because he talks about wireless technology, he talks about diving suits, and what Vayanar was trying to show was that a day will come when Indians will work with, say, the West, for him that was the British, on an equal footing, right? So the story was about the exploration and discovery of the lost city of Dwaraka in an undersea expedition. And the expedition was an international one. It was Indians and Britishers working on a joint science fiction expedition. And this was in 1891 or so, right? You're seeing a world in which we would be participating in science as equals, right? So in that story, that Indian aspect is important because it is talking about from a man who is seeing that India has kind of been left behind in the science and technology race. So when you find the Indians do play a central role, then it does become an Indian science fiction story. But of course, it could just be as simple as somebody who is of Indian origin writing a story. And for me, that would qualify just as well, right? For that matter, something like Ian MacDonald's, let's say, River of Gods, right? Now, this is an American who came to Varanasi. He lived there for a year, and he writes his story. And it's set in Varanasi, and it's a story that is full of spectacle and action and far future and so on. It's a science fiction story. Would we call it Indian science fiction? My answer would be yes, because India plays a central role in that story, right? But for many people, it wouldn't qualify because Ian MacDonald is an American, right? So I don't think the citizenship is as important as the context of the story. That would be more important for me.
Absolutely. I mean, I fully agree with Anil Bhai's, assessment. Bal Podke once said that Indian science fiction is Indian because of its soul. And I was like, this is so fascinating that even when talking about science fiction, we have to talk about the idea of soul itself. And he writes about this in this lovely, collection called It Happened Tomorrow, 93, National Book Trust. He has this wonderful, preface to this anthology, which is a translation from different Indian languages into English. So this is a book which I suggest you can read if you're interested in early science fiction. Also, if you want to read more about history of Indian science fiction, then Shupono Banerjee's Indian science fiction is a great sort of starting point. So yes, I have learned to sidestep this question a long, long time ago because what do you mean by Indian science fiction? What do you mean by the idea of India? What do you mean by science? What do you mean by fiction? What do you mean by this whole gestalt and whole? It's that if you are writing in, from, or about India from a certain speculative vantage point that could be rationalized using science, pseudoscience, alternate science, quasi-science, proto-science, whatever, it is science fiction. I'm not massive on, pigeonholing. I'm like, you do what you want to do, I'll do what I want to do, as simple as that. Let's not,
Yeah, but at the same time, I think you thought for a long time about coming up with this model to think about Indian science fiction. And Anil, sorry, we can't delay the model any longer. So I'm going to ask Priyanka to just switch.
Right,
so that's the model
right,
up there.
So that's the model. This is from Star Warriors of the Model, of the Modern Raj, University of Wales, Press 21, my last monograph. So essentially what drove me towards this model was the simple fact that while I was working on Indian Anglophone science fiction, including Anil Bhai's work, Priya Sarukoi Chabria, who's not here, fascinating writer. I suggest you read her. If you're into aesthetics, think science fiction being written by a poet. And that is when you get Priya Sarukoi Chabria's works. I wish she were here. So yes. So point being that when I was sort of going through all of these lovely, fantastic, wonderful novels and short stories, I realized that there were no theoretical models to explain them. Well, we had models, but they were coming to us from the global north. They were coming to us from the west, quote unquote. And I asked myself, would we always remain data? Global north would always be theory, and global south would always be data. And I was like, if we are talking about our own narratives, our own texts, shouldn't we be evolving protocols and frameworks that arise out of our own cultural, historical context? You can't just take a theory, or a hypothesis which comes into being at a particular location and say, okay, well, this is applicable everywhere all the time. So there has to be a certain kind of localization. There has to be a certain kind of reinterpretation of theoretical interventions, theoretical models, and their analysis and their application to other cultural locations, right? So that is when I said we need a theory for the global south. We need a theoretical framework to understand science fiction, to explicate science fiction from the global south, in this case, India. And that is where the in situ model came into being, about how, when you talk about the idea of space, time, and being, you got to have different kind of theses that activate different nodes of the very idea of, say, spatiality, temporality, or alterity, otherization. The first is the transmit thesis. If you go back to a science fiction text, specifically an Indian science fiction text, please try to ascertain the entanglements between technology, ideology, and mythology. Why is it that Koi Mil Gaya has aliens, but those aliens come to us because of a particular sound of Om that this machine makes? How is that linked to a particular ideology at that time? How is that linked with a particular technology? Similarly, Joker. Have you heard of this film? Akshay Kumar, not the Batman Joker. Akshay Kumar Joker, 2013, right? So essentially, in 2 lines, a space scientist from NASA comes back to India to work for his particular village, realizes his village is vastly underdeveloped. To bring it to the attention of the world, he has villagers make these sort of crop circles. Right? And everybody comes to the village gets super successful, but then people find out that these are human beings making these crop circles, and everything goes in for a toss. The village fool goes and prays, God, please save us. And you have an actual UFO descending in that village, shaped like a shivling. 2013, Joker, right? So look how mythology works, how technology works, how ideology works in certain narratives. I mean, they may have different ratios, but usually, most of science fiction texts, and my data was primarily Indian Anglophone science fiction. You can all, of course, scale it up to other languages and cultures, right? But my data was Indian Anglophone science fiction post-2000. So you see this sort of interaction between technology, ideology, and mythology. The second thesis was about the idea of time, which is the Antekal thesis, right? So I was like, how do narratives, when you are world building now, when you are creating worlds, how do your characters, how do your narratives engage with the idea of time and temporalities itself, right? So that is why we had the Antekal thesis, right? So think Greek and Latin ante and anti, before time, against time, right? Kal means time, right? So before time, against time. Also think Ant e Kal, the Persianesque, the end of time. Also think Anant Kal, eternal time, right? So what are the kind of temporalities if something happens in, say, radioactivity, 1896, right? Suppose I were to tell you in a particular short story that radioactivity was discovered in a Nigerian village in 200 BC. And that is the entire sort of narrative of the story, right? So you see different kind of temporalities being activated by narratives that something is happening before time. Happening before time, it activates it goes against the notion of the global north time, right? And then, so this is one node, right? These two go together. The other two, end of time and eternal time, they also go together. You have cyclical universes, you have, say, an Abrahamic, eschatology where the universe ends, so end of time, or then you have, the dharmic idea of cyclical time, right? So, so what kind of temporalities do you play with? How do you handle the idea of time and temporalities itself? And the third, of course, is the idea of being. This is the, where I had the maximum fun. I was like, I don't want a hypothesis which says to prove this. I'll have a cool hypothesis. I'll just brainstorm about it. Who are the others in your world now that you have built these worlds? Who are the others? What makes them the others? We talk about AIs and zombies and clones and aliens, right? In science fiction, right? And mutants. What makes them the other? So I said, I'm going to have this hypothesis and I'm going to treat monsters not just as monsters, but as this particular acronym, which was mutating ontological narratives in space-time echoing realistic simulations. I was like, this is going to be my hypothesis, and I'm going to take my data, and I'm going to see if I can sort of prove this hypothesis or not. As I said, I was having fun. I had no scholarly sort of ambitions. I was just having fun with my data because A, I wanted to create a model that sort of evolved out of India, and secondly, something that was aware of and conscious of India's own specific trajectories of thought, right? So when you think of zombies, for example, just one example. Zombie Ready, Telugu film, 2020, 2019 or 20, right? So usually, how do zombies come into being? Zombies come into being because, well, this virus escaped the lab, right? In this film, a Telugu film, zombies come into being in a particular location, I think it's Guntur, like somewhere in Andhra Pradesh. There's this chap who's trying to work on a COVID vaccine. And the whatever he's working on gets loose, infects people, and they turn into zombies. So technology creates people into zombies, right? But the film has a happy ending. The zombies are finally cured. Do you know how? There's a particular temple in Andhra that has a sarovar, temple sarovar. And that temple sarovar has water. And once you pour that water on zombies, suddenly they become normal human beings again, right? So this idea of, ideologies of, mutating narratives, because zombies, again, are drawing their tradition not just from, say, the US, but also from, say, Africa, voodoo, So there's a certain history of the idea of zombie itself. But we take that idea, we appropriate it, we make it our own, and we do it with so much zeal, enthusiasm, panache, that this kind of appropriation or engagement seems utterly normal, or natural, right? So yeah, so that's the model right there.
Thank you, Sami. I think, we would really like to hear about the New Monsters project a bit more, but before that, I think I'd like to transport Anil bang into the middle of Sami's model, because, so he has this, the first thesis, he sets up these three axes, right? Technology, ideology, and mythology, and talks about Indian science fiction as spanning that space. So I was wondering if you could locate yourself, given these three axes. Maybe we can turn a little bit more to each of your writings in specific. So where do you kind of place yourself? If you can, locate yourself first, and then I'll ask you a follow-up question.
So I think the work that, of my works, the one that is clearly, most definitely science fiction, The Beast with 9 billion feet, was in the Neo Monsters space. It was about genetic technology that had run amok, actually. So I think that would be the logical place. There needs to be an item number somewhere in this model, is what I'm thinking. So, but it is in the Neo Monsters that the idea of difference, the idea of the other is fascinating. And it's not restricted to science fiction, it's common across literature. But I like to think in terms of what technology is doing to us, right? We become strangers to ourselves, in a sense. So, for example, all of us have an Aadhaar card. And what happens to a person who doesn't have a card, right? Then they become a kind of a freak, someone who doesn't fit. They become the other. So I think stories which explore the other is where I would naturally gravitate towards when I write science fiction.
No, thank you. And something else in your writing, I think, is you write about technology. You do write about things like digitization and what does that mean for us. You write about, coding, all of that. But you also write about deeply philosophical, mathematical ideas, ideas in theoretical computation, leading to exploring ideas about language and so on. And I don't know if there are too many writers who, write from that vantage point. So one, if you can talk a little bit about that, and then also, I know you have a reading for us, so maybe we can also go on to that so that there is enough time for questions.
Do we have time?
I think we have time.
Okay.
What we'll do is, Priyanka, if you can just put up that image. So maybe you can tell us, why did you choose this image for your reading? And we can do a quick reading, and you can talk about the philosophy and the math. Yeah.
This is actually street art. It's street art from Thailand, I think in Penang. And it's one of those realist pieces, right, where this kid is reaching for something. I think the stool is not real. The stool is not real. The stool is real, I think. But the rest of it is all part of the painting. And somebody has placed an apple in that little space. So it looks, overall, it's a combination of the real world as well as the imagined. And for me, that has always been the kind of the area in which speculative fiction works. You can't tell whether something is purely imagined or it's purely real, taken from the real world or it's from the imagination of the author. So that boundary, that hybrid space, I find fascinating. And so this particular painting speaks to me. And the question was regarding...
And if you can also do the reading.
Reading, yeah,
the bell
sure.
curve, yeah.
So shall I go there or read here?
However, what is your preference?
Yeah, so I think that might be better there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is from the Sahitya Academy's journal, right, for Indian literature?
Could be, I think, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So this is going to be an incomplete story, which means you will have to finish it, right? Yeah. So I was reading Francis Galton, and he's got this book. He's the guy who was a eugenics guy, right? He's the guy who brought statistics into biology, and he realized that you could classify people as per the bell curve, and a whole bunch of characteristics, not just their height, but even IQ. So he's one of the early guys who began thinking in terms of measuring people and mapping them onto charts. And I always found him interesting because he was a good guy in his time. And today, of course, his reputation has taken a beating. And today we measure people in many different ways. So I was thinking about Francis Galton, his book, and since this is a class of students and they're all been bell curved to death, I thought I would talk about the bell curve. The story is called The Bell Curve. And it's about a kid who has just been born, and the story looks at him from a statistical viewpoint. Happy birthday, happy birthday, happy birthday, dear you. Welcome to planet Earth, brand new baby. Welcome to you and the 385,000 other babies born today. Oh, what wonderful adventures you're going to have. Let's see now. Are you a boy or a girl, or one of the 9 billion names of Brahma in between? Either way, there's a 48% chance, give or take a percent, the rest of the story is true. Shall we go with boy? Good, let's go with boy. Everything looks good. 2 legs, 1 pee-pee, 2 arms, 1 head. Ah, you're smiling. Your mommy has read in a book it's only a reflex, not a real smile. Your first social smile will happen some 4 weeks from now when you first fart. Prr, prr. Hey, it's so funny. No, baby? We humans have so many holes. Do it again, do it again. Prr, prr. Ha, ha, ha. Look at that smile. So cute. What a smile. You're going to be a lady killer. Oh, you are. Yes, you are. Everybody's so happy to see you. See, good things must be ahead for you. Nobody's sighing. Nobody's turning away disappointed. Nobody's plotting your death because you're a girl. Sweets are being distributed. There's music in the air. What is music? It is the universe swaying in ecstasy, baby. Never mind. You'll understand one day. Let's take a look at the other cards you have been dealt. You were born in India. You're a Desi, bro. If you had been Icelandic, there would have been a 63% chance of losing your virginity by 15.6 years. Instead, you might have to wait 22.9 years. That's 1,194 weeks. Shriek! Hush, hush, never mind, can't have it all. And it'll happen soon enough, especially with that smile of yours. You have a father and a mother, No real surprise there. There was an 84% chance your mother would survive the pregnancy. Look, your Indian father is walking around in a daze. Oh my God, a son. I have a son. What do I do next? Be a good father, everybody shouts. We'll all help. Don't worry. You're not the first father, nor the last. You have drawn a nice set of cards. It looks like this is a good family. You are lucky. Those other 384, 999 brothers and sisters of yours, not all were so lucky. But hush, hush, not today. No bad news on this green, glad, glorious day. Your family is fine. It even has a crazy uncle. Of course, all good families have a crazy uncle, so no one will give you the odds there. Crazy uncle has begun his Michael Faraday and Gladstone and what's the use of a new baby story. Everyone groans. Oh, crazy uncle, we have heard it all before. Okay, go ahead, crazy uncle. Tell your story. Get it off your system. So it seems Prime Minister Gladstone asked Michael Faraday, who is Michael Faraday, pipes your sister. She was born a few years before you and is still adorable, but she's going to end up in a madhouse, that one. Everyone grows. Just a famous scientist gone crazy, uncle. Don't mind her. She's an interrupter, disruptor. Don't mind her. But crazy uncle is upset with the word just. Excuse me? Excuse me? Just a famous scientist? Now crazy uncle has to tell the whole story of Michael fucking Faraday. Michael Faraday was a super baby. He makes other babies look like bums. Don't you worry. You'll also be a super baby. Oh, you will. Yes, you will. There's that smile again. Let's take a little walk. The world is so beautiful, so terrifying. Tiger, tiger, burning bright. Your eyes can barely see in the blaze of light. It's all a blur of colors and photons and savage geometries. And your father's croons. How odd it must sound, the peaks and troughs, the puffs of air against your cheek, the sudden flashes of teeth. Don't be afraid, super baby. It's all going to make sense soon enough. Sanity is overrated though, so be careful. Hooray! You have survived your 5th birthday. As an Indian, there was a 6.3 chance you wouldn't have. Did you know that? Phew, you didn't have any birth defects. Your parents weren't forced to finish you off. Your birth weight was normal. You didn't choke to death in your cot. You didn't swallow sharp objects. No virus was able to overcome your immune system. Your little heart could take on a lion. Here, stick your chest out. You deserve a medal, you little fighter, you. You're going to have to go to school. That's certain. But where? Mother says, well, my son's going to get the best unfair advantage money can buy. Father says, well, he's my son too. And if Babu Rao, Kanduchi, Kamate High School was good enough for me, it's good enough for him. Mother says, well, your good enough hasn't really taken you far, has it? Father says, mother says, bow, wow, wow, bow, wow, wow. It's scary when your parents argue, isn't it? You sense they're not really arguing about you. Don't worry. The divorce rate is just 1.1% in India. Nothing is significant if it's less than 5%. Yes, sir. That is a sacred truth from the holy book of Sir Ronald Isler Fisher, FRS, the goddamn god of datum. You're a lucky baby. You can survive insignificance. But unhappy marriages are tricky to quantify. They are all uniquely unlike. If your parents are unhappily married, it can be hell on your prospects. Will your parents drift apart? Let's check the odds. Now, a minute. Okay, you score well in tests, but you're not a topper. Year after year, you take your place in the middle class of the bell curve. No problem, you have grit, that's what counts. Remember how even when you were sick, you limped to class and were able to remember everything you had by hearted the night before? Not like your sister, the one who never studies, the one who failed a class, the one who fills pages with equations, always fiddles with the telescope crazy uncle had brought her when she had been the new thing. One night, you're awakened by her cold hands on your face. Wake up, my darling, she whispers. And you know it's just a dream because she's cold as death. Happy birthday, baby brother. I've named a new asteroid after you. Relax, this is your story. You're still special. That's what that little anecdote was meant to show. How many people have asteroids named after them? Hint, less than 0.40004%. You will find other ways to make your parents proud, keep them hopeful. You win the guitar competition. What a waste of a mind, crazy uncle might have grumbled when he used to still come over. Don't make that anti-smiley face. Listen, don't be worried. The world still branches out in front of you. So what if engineering didn't work out? Only 35% of high school graduates go for engineering these days. The action's in commerce, bro. 30% of Gujarati grads are commerce majors. Follow the smart money, boss. Start a company, get on Shark Tank, stare on venture capitalists, make alphas rock hard with phrases like global index mortgage rates. Can't you see it? You can go bankrupt 3 times, start a toilet paper company for dogs, become a billionaire, end up on CNBC, answer pouty questions from Maria Bartiromo. At least start by going bankrupt. Take a chance. And there are so many nice things waiting to happen. Girls, oh my God, don't go away, bitch sister, or your dad. Girls are some of the nicest things that can happen. Feel the tingle in your stomach, that first night, the first touch of a woman. At the very least, you can be a great husband. What went wrong? Look, champ, nothing went wrong. You know the odds of that, of nothing going wrong? Rather high, actually. So chin up, it's not you. The country doesn't allow things to go wrong. There, feel better? You already are a great son, so obedient, so sincere, so full of your culture, a comfort to your society. You are, yes, you are. Your parents, they look like worn slippers, don't they? You're such a good child, unlike some we could mention. Where is she, your sister, the heartless girl? Why is she living your life? Returning from work one day by train, you see a kid bouncing on his father's lap. The father is trying to read Steve Jobs' biography. Oh my God, nostalgia. For your 15th birthday, your father had brought you the very same, a book, you'd exclaimed, wishing the old man had gotten you Air Jordans instead. It's the only book you have read cover to cover. Jobs, what a guy. A super baby, that one. Stay hungry, stay hungry. You must take your chances in life, your father says, his eyes scrolling a private horizon. He looks so exhausted, your creator. He pays the cashier, heads out, then suddenly sits down on the bench outside. He's breathing like an accordion. I'm fine, he says, wheezing. What did he say? Imagine. Poor old slipper. You wait by his side, unwilling to grow up. Let us go home, Dad. Yes, he says, hands on knees, gazing up at you. What does he see, the old man? You look up at your son's face. He looks worried. You know what the kid is thinking? The old man's gonna croak. Relax, beta. The good news is I have the heart of a lion. The bad news? Life is fucking long, kid. Your son smiles, such a beautiful smile. He is gonna go far. He is, yes he is. You rise, pat your sperm carrier on the cheek. He thinks you have forgotten, but you haven't. It's his birthday, and you have planned something special. Thank you.
Thank you, Anil. So I got my chits. I looked at the organizers to check if time is stretchable in a science fiction panel, but it doesn't look like it, and it'll be nice to take some audience questions. So, Sami, we couldn't get to, aliens in Delhi, for example, but I want to give you a little bit of a teaser. It's my favorite line from one of his stories. It's called Biryani Bagh, and it says, the opening line is, a remote signal turned on my soul, and I felt biryani. Okay, so I hope you will read more of his work, but let's open it up for questions. So please, anybody who has a question, keep it short so we can take as many as we can in the few minutes we have left.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
So one of the core features of science fiction is like the tension between man and machine, right? And it's very exciting idea. Like we've used technology to make our life easier, and the fear that it might overtake us. And a classic example that comes to mind is Ridley Scott's Alien. So science fiction, it captures the imagination when it comes to the possibilities of technology, but in India, the beginning of our technology was also quite violent, right? So as science fiction writers, how do you negotiate this relationship, and what do you think it means for the future of the genre in India, especially when the world is rapidly arming itself with technologies that the earliest science fiction writers, frankly, were warning us about?
I think that's a great question. But I would say that rather than having a normative function to science fiction, one should just write stuff that makes them happy. For example, what makes me happy is pulpy, trashy science fiction. It makes me really, really happy. I love trashy, pulpy science fiction, writing and reading it. But you know what? What is the really interesting thing? Again, Aliens in Delhi, this is what we were talking about. That you take a particular genre You take a particular structure, you take a particular mode, and then you just change one little sutra, one little episteme within the structurality of that structure, and see that system implode, explode, stabilize, destabilize. So when it comes to technology, when it comes to science fiction can be technophobic, it can be technophilic. It depends on who you are, what you are trying to say for that particular period, for that particular audience, And, I would just say, that if you think you like science fiction, perhaps you haven't read enough of science fiction. And if you think you hate science fiction, perhaps you haven't read enough of science fiction. Because science fiction is an absolute spectrum, right? So you will find science fiction that engages with, say, exactly these kind of concerns, existential concerns, philosophical concerns, scientific concerns. You will also have science fiction that is just trash, but in a good way, and it's proud of being trash. So I would say that see science fiction, read science fiction, and write science fiction as a spectrum, and just locate yourself on where you lie on that, vantage point. What is your vantage point? Where do you lie on that spectrum? And then just proceed accordingly. So you mentioned Ridley Scott, na? I mean, see Raised by Wolves, by the way, if you're a Ridley Scott person. Interesting.
Thank you. Can we have, so I see a hand there. I see 3 hands, but we may have time, if they're quick, then for 2 questions,
Hello, great discussion. I just wanted to ask, when science fiction is dealing with a lot of complex scientific notions and a lot of the readers aren't very well versed in these concepts, are there any mechanisms or characters designed in the novels to make sure there's a sort of indirect explanation of what these mean, or do you want them to do their own research and draw their own interpretations?
So I think it's like one of the arranged marriages, right? You find the author who responds to you in the way that you want them to respond. So the hard SF crowd, right, is like hard ass. They'll basically say, well, do a course in physics before you read my book, right? Whereas the soft science fiction, like Ursula Le Guin, right, it is not necessary at all. You could come to a novels from any direction, and it is perfectly comprehensible. And by and large, the practice is the author makes it clear. You don't have to go read other books to understand what the author is talking about, right? It would be kind of a failure, actually. Of course, a little bit of background knowledge would be useful.
We may not, in fact, have time for more questions. So it would, I think Sami and Anil are around for a little bit more, at least till lunch. And so if you would like to talk with them, please feel free to. I think they'll be happy to answer questions.
Always happy to have, nerd out sessions.
Yes.
Anytime.
Always. Okay. Thank you all. Firstly, thank you, both of you. It was a lovely session. Thank you all for being a wonderful audience. I'm going to use a term from one of Anil's books and use it out of context. It was really fab jab. Thank you. Yeah.